I like to talk about them because I know I'm not alone in that. I know many other people in this room have suffered from similar things. I think the most important thing when it comes to violence, whether it be violence experienced by veterans or violence experienced in any part of our society, is simply to open up and to talk about these things. So my lecture today is entitled The War on Personal Terror, PTSD, and Victims of Violence. What I'd like to focus on here is compare and contrast the experience of PTSD when it comes to returning veterans, but also when it comes to the stories of sexual abuse survivors. Initially, when I put this lecture together, I had asked a number of local veterans here if they would share their stories with me, and then I was going to share their stories here. What I decided to do, since we have this forum available on Monday of this coming week, is to let them share their own stories. The stories I'm going to tell today are not of people that I know. It's research that I did online, but I think there's some important stories that share some important themes about this subject. What I'm hoping to do when it comes down to this lecture is, number one, give some background here as a historian talking about the origins of our own culture of violence. Why is violence happening in society? Is it nature? Is it nurtured? Is it something inherent in the human experience? Or is it something taught that we're learned? Number two, in terms of talking about PTSD, I'd like to talk about some of the challenges, not just for the veteran or the sexual abuse survivor who's coping with PTSD, but what it means to be part of a family that's coping with PTSD, because it's not something that individuals cope with alone. Number three, to give some examples of this, we're going to explore a few different case studies to talk some specific aspects of different people who have coped with this, how they've coped with it. At the end here, I've hoped to build some empathy and understanding with those who are suffering from PTSD. And specifically, I have intentionally not used the word sympathy. People who have been victims of violence do not want your sympathy. They don't want you to say, oh, I know what you're going, oh, I'm so sorry. They want you to recognize their fellow humanity and their worth as human beings, because we've all experienced different tragedies like this, and at the end of the day, we're all in this together. A few of the terms I'm going to use today, sorry, this is the professor in me trying to be scholarly. Let's define some terms here. The first term we're going to be using throughout the lecture today is trauma. I've defined it here as a mental or physical affliction that the natural defense and healing mechanisms of the body cannot cope with. Oftentimes in the medical profession, we talk about trauma units in hospital if somebody has had an injury to some part of their body that the body can't physically heal, and therefore medical doctors step in and try and heal that. The problem when it comes down to mental trauma, it's obvious to be able to recognize and see physical trauma because it's on the outside. Mental trauma is an internalized aspect, and it's oftentimes very difficult for the individual to share. Number two, in terms of experiencing trauma, I've talked here about depersonalization. What I put it is the temporary removal of personhood due to uncontrollable external events. And it's important to understand when it comes down to violence, violence is a choice that human beings engage in, and it's where one human being is taking power away from another human being. It's an external factor that comes onto us from the outside and affects us on the inside. Number three, I'm sure a number of veterans in this room can talk about this, the idea of triggers. I put here a trigger as, quote, an external factor that produces an internal response associated with the trauma. We'll talk about different triggers today and different ways that people have experienced PTSD. And the last term here, victimization, which I've termed as a process of experiencing loss of control. It's one thing to be in a situation where you're impacted by the outside world. It's a whole other level of trauma when you feel completely out of control in terms of the way the outside world is impacting your own internal world. To start off with, I'd like to share some quotes here with some different experts when it comes down to phenomena of violence and trauma to see if we can get some understanding of what exactly it is that we're dealing with here. What I like about this quote from Herman is that she's trying to look at the fact not only violence when it comes to soldiers, but trying to look at a larger culture of violence when it comes to the experience of growing up, in particular with adolescents. She says, combat and rape, the public and private forms of organized social violence, are primarily experiences of adolescent and early adult life. The United States Army enlists men as young as 17. The average age of the Vietnam combat soldier was 19. In many other countries, boys are conscripted for military service while barely in their teens. Half of all victims simulate the period of highest risk for rape is late adolescence. Half of all victims are aged 20 or younger at the time they are raped. 3/4 are between the age of 13 and 26. The period of greatest psychological vulnerability is also in reality the period of greatest traumatic exposure for both young men and young women. Rape and combat might thus be considered complementary social rites of initiation into the coercive violence at the foundation of adult society. They are paradigmatic forms of trauma for both men and for women. One of the questions then when it comes down to survival is one thing being a victim of something, it's another thing being a survivor, but then it's a whole other thing of taking that a step further. I think one of the great tragedies when we separate people who've been through trauma and don't give them the healing space that they need is that those people who are given healing spaces and can come out of this experience, come out some of the strongest and most incredible individuals and inspiring individuals you could ever meet. That's what I like about Lori's quote here about the idea of becoming a warrior. She says, even in times of trauma, we try to maintain a sense of normality until we no longer can. That, my friends, is called surviving, not healing. We never become whole again, we are survivors. Even in times of trauma, we try to maintain that sense of normality until we no longer can. That, my friends, is called surviving, not healing. We never become whole again. We are survivors. If you are here today, it's because you're a survivor. But those of us who made it through hell and are still standing, we bear a different name. Warriors. What I like about this quote is it reminds me a lot of my own mother. My own mother, for people who have seen me give lectures before on this subject, is hands down not only my best friend, but my own personal hero. Because what my mom went through as a young woman after the loss of her father at the age of 9, and what she went through at the hands of her great uncle for about 7 years of her life, it's absolutely unforgivable and could have and should have destroyed her life. But she came out of that the most amazing woman you could ever meet in your life. Yeah, my mom's a true warrior, and that's what inspires me to do the work that I do. One of the problems with PTSD then is the aspect of human memory. It's natural to have memories about the past, to reflect on memories of the past, but PTSD is a very different phenomenon. What I like about this quote from Cheryl Kershaw is it tries to get at the phenomenon of how these two different types of memory are different. She says, there are two types of memory frequently experienced by individuals who have had overwhelming trauma that had been suppressed psychologically or chemically. The first is general memory, experienced as an adult in which there is a natural recall of early events. The other is the memory often associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. The person suddenly smells, sees, and feels as though he or she is actually living the event that took place months or years earlier. Many soldiers who have survived horrifying combat experiences have PTSD, but PTSD has existed for centuries and affected men, women, and children in the midst of all wars, horrifying natural disasters, and other traumatic experiences. This includes physical and sexual abuse when we're growing up. I think that one of the great challenges of trying to figure out cultures of violence and how people react to violence is asking whether or not violence is inherent within human nature or whether it's a learned behavior that we get from around us. I think the importance of understanding this debate is it's both. There are certain things biologically which have driven human beings to be violent, to participate in violence, but there's also cultural factors as well. I think part of the problem when it comes down to figuring out nature versus nurture is that we have all sorts of mixed signals around us when it comes down to violence. Particularly when you think about something, oftentimes, particularly working with sexual assault, I've heard people don't mean them to be stupid, senseless comments, but I've heard so many people say stupid things such as, oh, boys will be boys. This is just what happens. It's just in human nature. There's nothing you can really do about it. It's always been with us and always will be with us. And I think that's a fundamentally wrong way of looking at it. I think that one of the challenges is even when we look to our own holy books that we try and learn morality from, there's mixed signals within those holy books as well. If you think about the concept of sin as being disobedience to God, God in the Old Testament gives us some mixed signals about the nature of violence. And if you obey God, sometimes, well, here, I'll give a couple of examples. We're all familiar with Exodus 20:13, where it says, God tells us, thou shalt not kill. But a few books later in Ezekiel, God also commands, slay utterly old and young, both maids and little children and women, And he said unto them, defile the house, and fill the courts with the slain. Go ye forth. And they went forth, and slew in the city. So which commandment do we obey? When God tells us to go forth or be violent, or when God tells us not to kill? That's part of the problem growing up in terms of this culture. We get mixed signals when it comes down to violence. When it comes down to the idea of society being flawed and being inherently evil, it's an incredibly challenging aspect of being a historian, is that people always like to look at the world around them and say, do you remember the good old days? Because they have this sort of nostalgia and past that there was some type of golden time associated with their youth when things were better, things were pure, a different nation. I think the problem with studying that as a historian, I cannot think of one single time in human history where a golden age has existed. It's simply the way people process memories as they get older. So when people say, remember the good old days, what's wrong with people nowadays? What they tend to forget, violence and the things that we see around us have always been with us. They're perhaps more prevalent nowadays because we have 24-hour days, 7-day-a-week media that shows us these images all the time. But I'm not sure that it's really appropriate in terms of trying to understand violence to say that there was some type of golden age when there wasn't violence. That's simply not true as a historian. I think part of the problem also when it comes down to aspects of violence, whether it be from our holy books or whether it be from our government, we also get mixed signals as we're growing up here. If you think about the idea of crime being some type of disobedience to the state, why is it appropriate for the state to make murder illegal in private life, but to condone it when it comes to other settings such as war? This quote from Max Stirner, he says, the state calls its own violence law, but that of the individual crime. Why is it okay for the state to command violence and murder, but for the individual private citizen not to? Once again, it's sort of an aspect of mixed signals, particularly for a soldier. I like this quote from Albert Hubbard because he says, so long as governments set the example of killing their enemies, private citizens will occasionally kill theirs. I think that's one of the great challenges of being a soldier and coming back and trying to experience normal civilian life. Your job before was to protect, but it was also to kill. And how do you go from that and coming back to private civilian life? It's incredibly challenging for many people. What we're first going to dive into then is talking about aspects of sexual assault. But before we dive into that, I'd like to talk about some similarities and differences in the experiences of those who experience PTSD associated with sexual assault and those who experience PTSD because their time as a veteran. One of the biggest problems when it comes down to any type of trauma is a certain amount of embarrassment and shame. Was I responsible for this? Was I to blame? And oftentimes we live in a culture where the victim of that violence is oftentimes held responsible for something that they weren't responsible for. That other person decided to impose violence upon them, and people should not feel to blame. And particularly when it comes down to one of the great myths about rape and sexual assault is that there's some kind of boogeyman hiding in the shadows that's waiting for you in the dark alley to do that. That is simply historically not true. The rapist and the molester is oftentimes a family member. And when it comes down to those aspects, how do you open up about that? How do you share that sense of shame, that sense of guilt? How can you overcome that? One of the other great problems, self-blame and survivor guilt. If you're a veteran, it's easy to understand because you look at situations, what a soldier does on the combat field is not about what they've been commanded to do, it's saving their own life and the person right next to them. And how do you deal with that when the person right next to you is gone at the end of the day? One of the other problems with survivor guilt when it comes down to sexual abuse, and it's something I had a hard time dealing with for years. My cousin who molested me as a child, I was his first victim. And had I stood up at the time and said something, and had the courage to say something with support, I could have saved 2 of his sisters from being continually raped, and about 15 other women in the future from being raped. And the guilt that I held for years about that, had I just had some courage and said something, the number of lives I could have saved. Because that's the problem when it comes down to these things. Once the damage is inflicted, it is so difficult to ever overcome that damage. So the process here is about prevention. In order to have prevention, we need to be open, we need to be honest, we need to have survivors of these things, not feel guilty about coming forward, because once perpetrators are brought out in public, they stop. We need to understand that.